All right, hello everyone. We have a different kind of video today. I'm actually joined by another human. This is Kathleen Mercury, my good friend, game designer, game design educator, and we've been hanging out this weekend. We thought we would do a video for YouTube as well. Why not? So she has about 20 years of experience in the industry, and so we thought it'd be cool for her to share 5 of the biggest lessons that she's learned from designing games, from teaching game design, from all this stuff that she's done. So for anyone who doesn't know Kathleen yet, maybe we can do a quick little intro.
Hi, I'm Kathleen. I'm a game designer with my first title, Grease Lightning, which came out in 2021 from WizKids, and my upcoming title, Tulip Season, which will be coming out from Sinister Fish later this year, early next year. I've taught game design for about 15 years to kids, helping over 600 kids design their own games. In addition, I've run game design jams. I just ran Designer Day for Gamma Expo. I now teach at Cal Poly Humboldt in the School of Education, so I help undergraduates become teachers. And I'm super excited that we could talk today.
Yeah. No, that's so awesome. And so I know it's tough to only pick 5 main lessons from such a wealth of knowledge and experience that you have. But what was the first lesson that you wanted to share?
Well, it's kind of funny because when we came up with this list last night, I actually cranked through it pretty quickly as far as coming up with ideas. So I guess I've got feelings.
Yeah.
The first one is do, don't write. So when I first started teaching kids to design games, I was making it up as I went along, and especially as a teacher, what better way do I have to know what kids are doing by have them write it down and tell me? But for game design, especially the more I learned, the Stanford D School boot camp for design thinking was hugely transformative for me. And one of the design mindsets is called bias towards action. So which basically means you could think about something or you start doing the thing, and as you're doing it, you're thinking anyway. And you just become better at designing faster, iterating faster, and especially for kids, it's also a lot more fun because you could write all these things, and as soon as you test it out, all that work that you did is gone. So the number one thing, so do, don't write, just basically means actually just start making something up, put it on paper, start designing the game. And with my kids, I became better at performance-based assessments. And so when I was, evaluating the kids on how they were doing it, I was actually evaluating it on the games they're making, not these magical games in their heads that didn't actually exist. So for you as a designer, when you're thinking about wanting to make a game, just start making it. Just start getting the ideas out. Just start anything ugly and rough. Get it on the table. Get it out of your head. Get it onto the table.
Totally. And that's such an interesting thing that you said there, that you will continue to think as you're doing. Right. Like a lot of people will think that, well, once I start doing it, then I'm not actually processing things, I'm not thinking about other possibilities. But it's so true that while you're doing it, you can think through a lot of things at the same time.
Yeah, and it also, I think, as a designer, helps you become more nimble and flexible in your thinking as you're designing. You break away from this, I create this perfect idea in my head, I put it on the table. It becomes a lot more fluid, the design process. And so your work evolves a lot more naturally and organically as you go.
I fully support that and believe in that. And that's one of the biggest things that I've learned, and I talk about it a lot on this channel as well, that when I first started in game design, I would try to think games to perfection. I still do it sometimes, but I'm a lot more aware of it now. Because, as soon as you make a game, you actually put it on the table, and even just play test on your own, you can see pretty quickly if there's actually potential there or not.
And it's funny because with my partner, I had a card game idea, and I just made the cards, and I was like, okay, let's see what happens. And after a while, he's like, are you just making this up as we go along? And I was like, yes. And he's like, we design games very differently. So I was like, we do. So I said, how about 15 more minutes of me doing it my way, and then we can be done. He's like, okay, I can do that. So that's what we did.
Yeah. Sometimes it really is good just to get it on the table and just see what happens. Because you can try to predict, but on like most of the time, you'll be completely wrong.
Right. And I think that's one thing for me. I'm a horrible judge of human behavior. I'm a horrible predictor of human behavior. And I'm not a natural mathematician that can calculate the odds of all these events happening and the frequency and tweaking it like that. You would think after working with kids for so long. No.
People will always do something you would never expect. Playtesters will ask a question you would never thought of or do something you would never predict. So you won't know these things unless you actually make it and test it.
Well, and I had a really cool experience because this past week, actually, because my friend teaches art education majors up here at Cal Poly Humboldt, and I help them with understanding games as art, just the basics of game design so they could make a project for their future classrooms. And for playtesting, one of the students in particular is really into games and put a lot of real game ideas into it, too much so. And so when we were playtesting, they said, "Oh, I'm so embarrassed." I'm like, "No, no, no, no. This is the good part. This is what you want. You want to see all these things break because they're going to break. No one will be helping you if they just say, 'It's great. It's really great.'" I said, "So every time you learn something new about your game and how you can make it better, that's the win." So you really have to shift that thinking from, "Oh no, everything is bad." Great. It's good you know that. So then you can focus on making it better.
Yeah. And focus on cutting things, which is always satisfying.
Yes, we played a game yesterday, a published game, and we both agreed that this was definitely a game where solutions were to add, not to streamline, and it could be a really great game.
If it had a bit more playtesting and development. Cool. Well, awesome. Let's move on to number 2.
Number 2 is Precious as Death. Next. No. So one of those, and this dovetails right after what we were just talking about. If you spend so much time on an idea, and this has happened to all of us, you've been working on a game idea, you've been playtesting it, and when there's a fundamental flaw in it, the hard thing that happens is you don't want to get rid of it. It's become precious to you. You know how much work has gone into it. So throwing out the idea that no longer works or isn't the best solution for the problem is so hard. And we really have to be mindful that when things become precious, it just means we hold on to bad ideas longer than we need to. And the sooner you can chuck it or adapt it, change it, fix it, then your designs will move forward. So when I run game design jams, I give people 10 minutes to design a game. Not an hour, not an hour and a half. And that's intentional. It's more of a spark for an idea. But in 10 minutes, you have to act quickly. You just have to make decisions. You just have to go. And the best part is if you hate what you've done, you only spend 10 minutes on it as opposed to an hour and a half and you hate what you've done. And so by forcing people to make decisions and to keep going, it becomes a lot easier to chuck out ideas because you just don't have time to really overthink them. So I used to give my students in the very beginning 3 weeks to design a prototype, and they made these beautiful art projects, and then they would play them and the games wouldn't work, and I'd say, "Okay, well, let's throw this out," and they wouldn't want to. And it took me way too long, honestly, as a teacher to realize I'm the problem. It's not it's not their beautiful games. I let them become precious art projects. And so I shifted to 2 class periods, maybe 3 class periods, 45 minutes each, make an ugly, testable proof of concept. And everything became so much better after that.
And so many designers do this, and I did this as well, focusing on making your prototype as beautiful as possible. Because that's something you can control and that's something that's fun. But at the end of the day, it's not what will make a game.
No, no, no. When I pitched Tulip Season to the publisher, it was Sharpie on cards.
That's another point, is that people feel like, well, if I'm going to pitch it to a publisher, it has to look beautiful. But the main thing is that publishers will want to make it look how they want it to look anyway. So you can. I've pitched games where it's just hand-drawn things. You've done it as well. Like, it does not need to be a professional, beautiful prototype to pitch it.
Yeah, I think with a caveat, because if the game is good and solid, then they can see that. If it looks really homemade, though, like Sharpie on cards, you just have to be careful to really convince the publisher of the value of the game itself, that this isn't something that you threw together in a few hours. Right. So that's the caveat. So you just still focus on the game itself. And I say, I make this flexible so I can make changes as needed. And I've had publishers say, I am so glad that you have pitched it to me just like this, because they understand my focus is on the game. You make the art how you want. And the artist for Tulip Season is one of the best, most beautiful game artists that it's working right now, and I'm so excited to see the final product.
Yeah.
And because they can do the cool part, I can do the Sharpies.
There you go. And especially for that game where it is so visual and it's so beautiful, but you're still so focused on the gameplay, making sure that works. You know it'll look beautiful. Right. So you don't need to focus on that right now. You just make sure the game works well, and you know an artist can bring that to life. So let's move on to number 3.
Number 3, kids are the best, worst game designers. And I became a game designer because I started kids to design games. And basically, I taught gifted kids, high IQ. So I had a lot of decision making over my classes of what we did, how we did it. So when I started teaching game design, it was literally, I'd just be gotten into gaming. Like, I don't know, let's make games. And so I learned so much along the way. And that's how I became a game designer, because I hate the expression, those who can't do teach. So I started designing games, and then I became a game designer, and here we are. So when I say the kids are the best, worst game designers, there's a lot of things where they'll say things like, well, I've never played a game about space before, so I decided I wanted to make them. And you're like, oh, you don't really know anything, because they're new, right? Their exposure for a lot of kids is only what I gave them. Right. But the thing that's also one of the best things about them is there's no limits. The brakes are off. And so it can be, what if is one of the best things that happens. It's like, you know what would be cool if, and I'm always like, yes, tell me. I play tested my games so much with them. I found real solutions to problems in games that kids pointed out that I was oblivious to, or I couldn't figure out a solution, and they did. That was cool. But especially just that unbridled like sense of fun and who your audience is and the ideas that they come up with. A lot of times their ideas aren't going to be that great, because especially if they don't have a lot of gaming experience, like anyone who's new, you have to play lots of games, build up their gaming literacy. But kids come up with some of the best out of the box thinking. They're not thinking about price point. They're not thinking about manufacturing. They're not thinking about potential publishers. All they want to do is make something fun and cool. Yeah. And so play test your games with kids.
But I can see that. I can see how the kids can like break your game pretty easily, because they just could see things maybe differently than adults might see it. You do offer a completely different perspective. And like I say, it's good to get all different kinds of perspectives when you're play testing. So kids included. Oh,
and kids have no problem with stabby, take that, send somebody back to start. I do as a designer. I won't let them put that in there. But there is a level of aggressiveness in some ways and luck that kids are much more willing to assume and enjoy in a game than adults are. When I wouldn't let my students make event decks, because they would be draconian. It would be like, the blue player loses all resources, goes back to start, and must give you all of their lunch money and their dignity. You're like, oh, okay. Slow roll. How about we let them move back 3 spaces? So that's the worst part, because they will put the hammer of justice down and you will just be a greasy spot on the floor. But riding that dragon means you get to go to all kinds of uncharted lands.
Really cool to get your perspective on that.
Play test with kids.
There you go. All right, number 4.
Number 4, design constraints are your friend. So the worst thing in a game design jam that I personally have experienced is when there's a whole bunch of resources and they say, go make a game. And for me, I don't know where to start, because there's so many ideas, there's so many possibilities. When you give me playing cards, you give me dice, you give me index cards. Yes, there's a lot of things that could be done, but if you're wanting people to design games, if you're wanting students to design games, or you're wanting to design anything, design constraints are good. So you don't want to be too restrictive, but you don't want to be too open-ended either. One of my favorite design challenges that I use is to design a race game. Race games are the most familiar form of games for like kids, so most, Sorry, Candyland, Life, Chutes and Ladders. Those are all race games in a way, so kids know how to do it. And so the main thing that they then focus on is how. And so just by saying make this type of game frees them up to make a lot of choices as far as how the races run. But I've also used that with published designers, like at Tabletop Network. I just did it Gamma Design Expo, give people constraints, and then it just gives them a really safe, within education, we call it scaffolded, place to start, so then they can really start pushing the boundaries. And eventually what would happen with my students, because I would have them play lots of games and we would talk about using ideas from different games, and kids would come up to me for their race game and they'd say things like, Miss Mercury, instead of the winner of the race being the first one who crosses the line, can it be where the first person who crosses the line ends the game, but then whoever has the most gem points wins? And I was always like, yes.
Yes.
Because that's always the goal. So many games look nothing like race games by the end of that project.
Right.
But it gave them a place to start where they could just start working and push the boundaries where they wanted. So for yourselves, I would say if you're having trouble coming up with your own boundaries, there are so many design competitions on Board Game Geek, Cardboard Edison, and a lot of game designers have gotten their start by doing those competitions. It gives them exposure when they do well, but also learning how to design in those constraints releases some of that pressure to come up with a perfect idea to start with. It just gives you a place to start, and that's really all you need.
Yeah. Like I'll do these game jams sometimes on this channel where I'll give myself a theme and mechanic and a minute. I started at 10 minutes and I brought it down to 1 minute, which is like, yeah, sometimes honestly that's all you need. And I tried doing it where I only gave myself a theme and it was impossible. Right. I was just like, there's too many possibilities. I need to give myself more constraints here. And when I did, it was easier. Right. You might think it's the reverse, but it's not.
Right, right. And the more you do it, and that's the other thing for design, do it a lot. It's like what your slogan is on the back of your sweatshirt. What?
The more games you design, the better designer you'll be.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. Yes. So if you've got one game that you love and it's your sweet precious baby, awesome. Also start making something else too.
There you go.
Yes.
1,000,000%.
Yes. Crush precious.
Yes. All right.
You're allowed to love nothing.
Precious is dead.
Precious is dead. Well, and that actually really matters because so when you pitch to a publisher, well, and I learned this my very first game called Dirty Birdie, and I pitched it to a publisher, they signed the game, and then immediately the discussion came to how do we retheme this from the start. And my favorite action in Dirty Birdie then was taken out of the game completely, and that was just dagger to the heart. It was one of my favorite things. But for what the retheme was, which was dragons, because they're basically like,
very hot right now.
The pigeons, yeah. Well, this was also like 12 years ago, but yeah, I know, right? I had poop in it, like I was just.
So it was basically about pigeons pooping, and they changed it to dragons pooping.
Pooping fire.
Pooping fire.
Yeah. So, by the way, Dirty Birdie looking for a new publisher. Hey. Anyway, that happens too, kids. That happens a lot. But if I said no, like this must be in the game, this is the theme, this is my work, this is my art, you have to remember that publishers need products that they can sell and stand behind. And you have to know, in the beginning it's really hard on where you can stand your ground, what changes you have to give into, what you can fight for more. And the more you do it, the more agency you tend to have depending on the publisher and all that good stuff. So that's something to think about too when it comes to being precious. Yes, getting it signed is awesome, but that's not the end of the road for those types of really, hopefully, interesting, fruitful, collaborative discussions between you and your publisher.
Yeah. I just wrote the design diary for a game I just recently designed, and I have a whole section about my killed darlings, RIP. And a lot of them, it was so hard to cut because I felt just such a connection to them, especially when they're ideas that I have from the very start of the process. You've had them for so long. They were part of the very first spark. It can be so difficult to cut them. And actually, one of them, the publisher really liked too. But I had to make the decision that it decreased the replayability. It had some pretty major flaws. So I had to cut them. But it made the game better.
And that's probably the hardest thing to do. I remember years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I was at Tabletop Network. Rob Davio was talking about what did you need to do in order to become a professional game designer if you want to make this your career. And I said, how do you know what, especially when you're working on your own, how do you know what needs to be cut when you're in that, revising process, basically? How do you know? And he said, good question.
Yeah, how do you know?
Right. And you don't, you make decisions, and sometimes they're the right ones, and then you realize later sometimes they weren't the right ones. And
Yeah, you can always bring them back.
right. Right.
I feel like, yeah, if you cut something, test it again. If now that problem isn't there, if things run smoother, if there's way less negative feedback, you know that, okay, that was probably the right choice. Right. If you're still having the same problem, then that wasn't the issue, it was something else. But you usually will see through testing if it was the right call.
Right. Yeah. Especially with kids.
There you go. All right.
Right.
Are we on the last one already?
On the last one already.
Okay.
So this, let's see. Okay, I'm trying to read my handwriting, and actually Pam had to translate my writing this morning. Surprise! Design is about people. What? This, you might be like, duh, which is true. But really and truly, there's a couple of important aspects to this. One, in terms of working with kids, when it comes to design is for people, kids especially, they're in this bubble of their own selves, right? We all were there when we were their age. And so to understand the needs of your user, design is all about understanding the needs of your user. And that first step, Stanford Design School, is empathy and understanding what your users need. Right. And so that's a really interesting perspective to take, especially when you're coming to who is the audience for this game? What do they want? What do they need? And so that's a super important thing that is easy to kind of get lost in when we are so focused on our side of the table, to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, what the other person on the other side of the table, what they would think. That's super, super hard. But we have to think about who are we designing for so much in what we're doing. And also the other lesson from my students, when I would ask them, and I think this is a lovely way to sort of wrap this up, the last thing I would ask my students was, what will you take from this experience that you will carry over in the rest of your life, in your academic life? Because if my game design class was just about designing games, then I wasn't serving them well as students. Yeah. There had to be more to it, right? And they would say things like, if I'm struggling, then I can ask someone else for help. Other people can help me come up with ideas. It's important to get feedback on unfinished work. All these things those are the skills that we really want them to take from this to move forward in their lives. And so I think that part, especially when you're thinking about your designs and being a designer, being really mindful of the process, being really kind to yourself. This is hard work. Some people really don't like being told no. That's enough for some people. Just stop trying to be a game designer. They pitch a few times, they're told no. They say, this isn't for me. It's all tough, and so just be kind to, and you're one of those people too that you need to be mindful about, and then
right.
What you take from it and how you apply it.
Yeah. And being open to feedback, not being defensive, like being receptive to that kind of thing. And it can be tough to hear a lot of that, especially when you start playtesting with people who aren't your friends and family. And then you start getting some real, it could be sometimes harsh, but it might be what you need to hear.
It is what you need to hear. Yeah. Because, and I think this comes from being a woman too, sometimes when it comes to going to playtesting events, is sometimes, especially if I'm around a group of men and I'm the designer, they're not, they don't want to hurt my feelings, which is lovely. But also that's when I can take it. So the thing that I always say is, I know this game has problems. I can't fix them unless you help me identify what they are. You don't have to solve them for me,
right? But
help me find the problems. And so if all they do is tell me 10 things that they do not like about the game and they tell me nothing positive, honestly, that's still a win. Great, I've got things to work on.
Yes.
The hardest part was when I was playtesting Grease Lightning, and I, working through it with people, and I was like, they're like, okay, well, we really like this, we really like this, I'm like, okay, yeah, right, but like, what needs to be worked? And my friend's like, Kathleen, it's good. Like, I like the game. And I'm like, yeah. Oh, okay.
I get that. I'm like, that's not, no. Something must be wrong here that needs to be fixed.
Right. And I think that's actually maybe even the best way to end is sometimes with the design, it's never finished. You just have to stop. And maybe it's stopped in a way that it's not ready to be pitched and it just needs to sit on the shelf for a while and think about what it's done. And sometimes it is ready to be pitched because publishers will always want to tweak things. I've pitched games and said, this is 90% done. And that rest of the 10%, what do you want?
Sometimes it might actually be 20 or 30%, not quite done yet. Yeah, it's so true. And a lot of people will ask me, like, when do you know a game is done? And it's like, yeah, it never really is. But for me, when after playtesting, if there's not a huge discussion about all these things that didn't work, if it's more just talking about what they enjoyed, when they can buy it, these kinds of things, then I feel like, okay, maybe in my head, I feel like there's still things that could be better. If the discussion is just talking about like all the positive things that they liked, then I'm like, okay, I need to stop. I think it's done. It's definitely pitchable. And I think I need to just stop tweaking it at this point. And also when you start pitching, you can still be tweaking. And even after it's picked up, you can still make changes if you want. But at a certain point, you just need to step back and then be done and have it be turned into an actual finished product.
Right. And I think both of us probably have things in our published games that we wish would be different.
Yep.
Great. Move on to the next project. Yeah. Peggy Brown, in one of our Board Game Besties chats, I think it was, Peggy Brown said something that was really, really, that has always resonated with me. And the question came up, well, what happens if, the publisher wants to make all these changes and, and she's like, sign it. Yeah. Move on to the next project.
Exactly.
And she's made like 200 games. Yeah. So she knows what she's talking about. And that, ties into the Precious thing. It ties into so many of these other things we've been talking about.
Exactly.
If you want to get it made, you just have to get it to that finish line.
Because you always know you have a million more ideas and a million more games in you. So just move on to the next one. Because, I haven't really dwelled on my published games being like, oh, I wish I had done this differently. Wish I had done that differently. Because I'm working on so many new games. I don't have time to dwell on that, Right. It's just, it's done. And when it's done, I'm done.
Right. And that's really healthy.
Yeah. I need to free up space for new games.
Right.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kathleen.
You're
That was
welcome.
super fun. Thanks, everyone, for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation and if it was helpful for you at all, I hope you consider liking and subscribing. Follow me on social media at Pam Walls Game Design and Kathleen.
All of my game design materials can be found for free. I pay for the hosting and all the other stuff. It is not monetized at all. It's purely a labor of love. All of my game design teaching materials can be found for free at KathleenMercury.com.
Perfect. Definitely check that out. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Bye. Bye.